What are your feelings going into this execution next week?
My feelings are that I hope it goes off as it's supposed to, but I have very little confidence in either Katie Hobbs or Chris Mays to do anything right, much less something as complex as an execution using lethal injection.
Why is that?
Because Katie Hobbs has shown that she's completely willing to hire an expert, uh, spend a great deal of taxpayer money on getting his advice, and then completely ignore that advice. Uh, Kate, Katie Hobbs has obviously never done anything in the criminal justice space. Chris Mays has never practiced law before she was an attorney general, and most of the lawyers she hired and brought into her administration were political hacks. They weren't they weren't lawyers who are used to doing criminal work either on the prosecution or defense side, and so it's not a very competent set of hands in which we've placed our state's administration of justice.
What is your stance on the death penalty?
I support the death penalty, like all good conservatives, of course. I'm deeply uncomfortable with the state having that kind of power, and I think it's got to be very, very carefully constrained and regulated. But we need it fundamentally, and the reason that we need it is because I don't think that society would really view justice as truly being delivered in some of the most exceptionally heinous cases that we have unless we carried out the death penalty. And so for me, it's not a matter of deterrence or anything like that. It's really a matter of fundamentally what society needs to function is for the public to have confidence that if they give up, the ability to take revenge when somebody's hurt a loved one, that the state will administer proper justice. And so it's a necessary evil, but it's something that we have to monitor very closely.
Is this the first time you've advocated for a firing squad? And what prompted this? How did you get this idea?
But I got the idea from the expert that Katie Haas had hired to do a review of Arizona's death penalty practices, and hired at taxpayer expense, I will reiterate. And when he came back and he said, look, we've had all these problems as a state doing lethal injection before. The botch rate for firing squad, though, is zero, as opposed to the several botched executions that Arizona has had using lethal injection. He goes, the state ought to seriously consider just switching to the simpler method of the firing squad. And I read that, and somebody who has been to law school and has practiced law, I'm well aware that most people on both sides of the aisle who really understand the topic think that the firing squad is a better method. One, because the botch rate for every recorded execution that we had in the United States using the firing squad method is zero, as opposed to every other method which has a botch rate. And two, the lethal injection method is both very unreliable and also very expensive. And they're unreliable, and it's unreliable and expensive for the same reasons, namely that the suppliers of these drugs keep changing because different suppliers go, well, we don't want to do that or whatever. So the state tries to procure a large amount of the drugs necessary to cause death. And I think the last time we procured those drugs, it cost $1.5 million. But like everything else, those drugs have an expiration date. And we don't do that many executions in the state. And so the consequence of all of that is that we're spending a huge amount of money to procure a bunch of drugs, doing one or two executions with it. Then we have to spend the money again. Whereas with the firing squad, I mean, cost of a bullet's 50 cents. You got five people typically on a firing squad, it's 250. And that's $2.50. So, and of course, the supply of bullets is fairly reliable, actually extremely reliable, unless you're like me and you've got an AK model rifle, in which case recent geopolitical events have made the supply somewhat less reliable. But for the firearms used by the Department of Corrections, they're going to be able to very readily and easily source those bullets. So all of those things make firing squad incredibly superior to lethal injection. And by the way, that's a bipartisan view. Like I said, the expert that Katie Hobbs hired said that. Uh, Democrat Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor has said that. And of course, many on the right, including myself, have said that as well. It's a common sense thing that needs to happen.
You bring up a really good point here. So I've been following your legislation uh, for this year. And what are your feelings on the feedback that you're getting and the different opinions that are coming in?
For the record, my name is Nicholas Cody, speaking on behalf of conservatives concerned in opposition to HCR 2024. Changing the method of execution does not address the real and immediate problem that Arizona faces with its current and soon-to-be used method of execution. That is a lack of transparency and accountability. As a general principle, the government's actions should be open and in public view. Sunshine enables fiscal watchdogs, voters, and taxpayers to evaluate the costs and benefits of policies, root out corruption, and make officials answerable for wrongdoings and errors. But critical information about Arizona's execution practices has been withheld from the public. The state's lethal injection drug procurement has been marked by secretive sourcing of drugs of suspicious origin and quality. This history justified the action Governor Hobbs took in Executive Order 5 near the beginning of her term. In it, the governor stated, quote, Arizona has a history of executions that have resulted in serious questions about ADCRR's execution protocols and lack of transparency, and a comprehensive and independent review must be conducted to ensure these problems are not repeated in future executions. But before a final report could be completed, Governor Hobbs abruptly fired the independent review commissioner, and the administration now insists that an internal review is sufficient. That's simply incompatible with the very terms of the executive order. The problems Governor Hobbs identified January 20th, 2023 are still present today, and the working draft of the report raises even more questions. A lack of transparency and accountability cannot be solved with a self-assessment and continued secrecy. Instead of switching to a different method of execution that brings its own challenges, the legislature should seek real steps toward transparency and accountability, including amending Section 13757 of the Arizona Revised Statutes to ensure there is transparency regarding drug procurement and conducting ongoing oversight of the governor's decision to terminate the review. Thank you, for questions.
Excellent. Any questions for the guest?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have questions.
Mr. Vice Chair, please.
First, Katie Hobbs has been withholding information? I'm shocked. I've never had that happen to me, Mr. Chair. Can you tell us a little bit more about maybe your request for information and what Katie Hobbs has been withholding from you?
Yeah, well, it's not just from us. It's from, Mr. Chair, Representative.
Thank you.
It's not just requests from us. This has been an ongoing problem for years that really started before the Hobbs administration. Part of the problem is that the statute exempts from public disclosure certain information about the procurement of lethal injection drugs. But it really goes much beyond that. The review that Governor Hobbs established or called for looked into much more than that. And so, for instance, one of the findings that the independent review commissioner found and laid out in the review in public comments that he has made afterwards were that he discovered that some members of the execution team in 2022 were paid in cash $20,000 each for 3 different executions, so $60,000 total. And he asked for tax records. Basically, are there 1099s for these payments? And a few days after he asked those questions, that's when Governor Hobbs decided to terminate the review. And the media has really followed up on that, numerous times since then. And as far as I can tell, they've continued not to comment on the lack of records of those transactions.
Mr.
Another
Chair,
question,
Mr. Cote, I just want to make sure I heard that correctly. On behalf of the state of Arizona, the Hobbs administration paid executioners in cash?
Mr. Chair, Representative, those cash payments were under the prior administration, which had conducted the last executions. But for whatever reason, the Hobbs administration either did not have or refused to answer the questions about any documentation.
Very strange.
Mr. Vice Chair, you have another question?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, sir, this is my final question, which is, you go, well, why are you guys doing the firing squad thing? Why are you changing things that way? Well, don't you understand the Arizona Constitution prescribes the method of execution? It's the only way we can change it. Why is it strange to you that we would be pursuing things that way?
Mr. Chair, Representative, I think it poses a number of problems, and I would like to to go back to a comment earlier just about sort of the supposed obviousness of the firing squad across the political spectrum, and that's simply not true. I think you should consider just how rarely the firing squad has been used in the modern era. It has been used 3 times, all in Utah. Both Utah and Idaho have at various points had the firing squad, gotten rid of the firing squad, brought it back. And I don't think that kind of flip-flopping, because there's frequently public disgust, when one of these rare firing squad executions take place, that public appetite has soured against it. And putting that in the Constitution just seems like, a real problem.
But when you talk about the prior administration, are you talking about the prior governor, Governor Ducey? Is that who you're talking about when you're alluding to the prior administration, Governor Ducey?
Mr. Chair, Representative, those executions occurred under the Ducey administration, yes.
Okay, I just want to make that point clear. Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Your investigation and the state's refusal to give you records has come from the Hobbs administration as a result of the Hobbs administration's planning for an execution, the Hobbs administration's independent review, correct?
Mr. Chair, Representative, that's correct. Governor Hobbs signed Executive Order 5 in January 2023 to establish an independent review, the premise of which was that an independent review must be completed before executions can be continued. That independent review was not completed, and the administration is now just saying, trust us, an internal review is sufficient.
Almost everybody that I've talked to has been supportive. Sometimes they don't want to vocalize it because they feel like it's a controversial position. But it's one of the things I've observed in politics, which is if you think something, probably a lot of people think that too. And I think folks tend to conceive of themselves as having very unique opinions. And, oh no, what if I let people know my opinion? Would they judge me? And in fact, pretty much everybody I've spoken to on both sides of the aisle supports it. I was disappointed to see, of course, my Democrat colleagues all vote against it on the floor, although several privately told me that they knew I was right, which is just a sad commentary on the state of our politics, I guess. But, I've gotten a few angry emails about it. I called one of the guys and explained to him why I thought that this was a necessary thing for the state to do. And after I explained it to him, he kind of got it. He was like, okay, that's understandable. I understand why you want to do that. And I think even most of the mainstream media that's reported on it has kind of acknowledged that it's probably the best thing to do is move to the firing squad. So I've been gratified with that response.
Do you feel that firing squad is more humane? I mean, if you're going to put someone to death, would you say that this is probably the most humane way to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because of that lack of botch rate, when a lethal injection goes wrong, it'd be hours of somebody essentially drowning in their own fluids. I mean, whereas we don't have a recorded instance in the United States of a firing squad execution ever going wrong. And that's why more and more states are switching to the firing squad method. I mean, I think we had South Carolina that switched. We had Utah that switched. There's a couple of other states I can't rattle off the top of my head. They've all recognized that it is more humane. And, I think it's the headline. They go, oh, firing squad, it seems so brutal. And of course, all methods of execution are brutal. But in fact, even though it might be somewhat counterintuitive, it's much quicker and much less painful for the condemned. And I think those are important things as a society is, we have to administer justice. We don't have to make people suffer for it. In fact, we're not supposed to do that. And I don't think our current methods of execution are, violate the Eighth Amendment or anything that, but I do think the Eighth Amendment tells us that there's a principle of trying to execute people in a way that doesn't cause excessive suffering more than is necessary to kill them. And I think firing squad is the method that we have that best accomplishes that.
Is it cheaper to keep someone alive than it is to put them to death?
Yes. So this is a common argument by anti-death penalty people is that it's cheaper to keep somebody alive, put them to death. Absolutely it is, but we don't administer the death penalty because it's cost effective. We administer the death penalty because society has deemed that for certain crimes that are so heinous, that it's the only way to really deliver a just result. And the deal that we make as a society is I'm going to give up my right to seek revenge if you hurt my family member, right, or somebody I love or care about. Okay, but in exchange, what the state is going to do is they're going to find the person who did it, and they're going to give them due process. And if they're convicted, there's certain penalties prescribed by law, including for our most heinous crimes, capital punishment. And that's kind of the deal that we make with our government. And I think a lot of people would be far less satisfied with that deal and far less trusting of our justice system to be the exclusive vehicle for delivering justice if we got rid of capital punishment. And that value, that willingness of society to trust the courts and the justice system, and to allow it to be that exclusive vehicle of retribution, in a sense, that has economic value that far exceeds whatever it costs to execute the condemned. So yes, it is more expensive to execute somebody rather than keeping them in prison. Nonetheless, it is a net benefit to society that we do it for the most heinous crimes, assuming, of course, again, that we have a very tightly controlled system, that we're very skeptical of it as citizens and make sure that it's not being improperly used, that the death penalty is not being overly expanded, and that the methods used are humane and the process to lead up to that point is robust.
How are you feeling about this legislation? Do you see it making its way through and onto the ballot? And
I think if it gets over to the Senate, it'll likely pass. The challenge is, of course, getting it over to the Senate, getting it placed on the board for a final vote in the House. And it's something that I continue to advocate for, and hopefully we'll see that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, it recommends that HCR 2024 do pass.
Thank you, sir. Any opening comments on this?
Yes, Mr. Chair. When Katie Hobbs took office, she hired a former judge to, at taxpayer expense, undertake an independent review of our state's method of execution, which is currently lethal injection. The preliminary results of this review indicated that the state should consider switching to the firing squad because it is a more humane method of punishment. That is a perspective that is widely shared by legal experts across the aisle. For example, Justice Sotomayor is of the opinion that the firing squad is a more humane method of execution than lethal injection, as is Fordham University professor Deborah Denham, and as, obviously, was Katie Hobbs's hand-picked expert. But instead of taking his advice seriously and asking this body to run a bill to switch our state's method of execution to the firing squad, as the taxpayer-funded independent analysis suggested we should do, she instead chose to fire that independent expert. Well, Mr. Chair, I for one believe that expert's analysis should be taken seriously. The firing squad offers several advantages over our state's current method of execution by lethal injection. It is far less expensive, both because it leads to less ancillary litigation and because the method itself is more inexpensive. It is also quicker and has a lower failure rate and is by far the most humane and expeditious way to dispatch the condemned. And for those reasons, I do urge adoption of the measure.
Thank you, sir. Representative Gutierrez, you're recognized. Question or comment?
Thank you. I rise for a comment on the bill. Thank you.
Proceed.
Thank you so much. I am appalled at this bill and that we would waste our voters' times on a bill like this. This bill says that anyone convicted and sentenced to the death penalty after 1992 would be killed by firing squad. I find it interesting that we just got done a few bills ago hearing about the sanctity of life and that we believe in life, we are here for life, thou shalt not kill, and then the same party is putting up a bill to use a firing squad to kill people. It makes absolutely no sense. It would be an embarrassment for Arizona, and I just don't know why we're wasting our time on bills like this to send to the voters while we could be talking about health care, affordable housing, keeping our resources safe, and protecting our public schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Chaplik, you are recognized. Question or comment on the bill?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a question for the sponsor.
Does the sponsor yield?
Yield.
Proceed.
Thank you. Representative, do you know what the cost to Arizona is for the lethal injection? Do you have any data on that?
Well, Mr. Chair, we would have a lot better idea of the cost if the independent review was permitted to proceed. But we do have at least a rough idea. The last time the state ordered drugs for lethal injection, it spent about $1.5 million on 1,000 grams of the chemicals used to cause death. And although that was enough for many executions, if they happened in very close in time, executions tend to be very spaced out. And the shelf life of this drug is very uncertain. Hence, if you keep it around sitting too long, it spoils and goes bad, and you have to order another batch.
Mr. Chair, I have another question, please.
Does the sponsor yield?
I yield.
Proceed.
Excellent. Representative, on this report you mentioned with Governor Hobbs when she fired her specialist, did it have any method of execution with the firing squad, caliber? How does it take place? Anything in that about the execution?
Mr. Chair, this is another example of somewhere where if the independent review were permitted to continue to proceed, that this probably would have been laid out. We do know from other states that executions are typically carried out by a squad of between 5 and 8 members who volunteer from the Department of Corrections, all of whom except for one have a live round and one who has a blank. We do know that the caliber is typically used is 30 caliber, so about 50 cents to $1 a bullet. And that we do know how facilities are constructed in terms of having an area in the prison with sandbags around it. So we know that it is a fairly inexpensive method compared to lethal injection.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, last question, if he's
Does
yielding.
the sponsor yield to one more question?
I yield.
Proceed.
Excellent. Representative, in all the execution data that's here in the United States, do you have any information on any botched executions or any percentages of how this all compares with death by firing squad?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Chairman Chaplik.
Thank you.
I am aware of a study of 8,700 executions in the United States. Of those, hanging had a 3.12% botch rate, electrocution a 1.12% botch rate, and lethal injection had a 7.12% botch rate. As with the last execution that the state of Arizona carried out, where it took somebody 3 hours to die, where he was essentially drowning in his own fluids for those 3 hours. Compared to that, lethal injection is not particularly humane when the firing squad alternative is available. Many states, including Utah, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Oklahoma, for these reasons, are switching to the firing squad. And you'll notice that after that botched execution that Arizona had, our state entered into a moratorium on capital punishment, which delayed the swift delivery of justice that the people of this state deserve. With the firing squad, we will not have these issues. We will not have the issues of having difficulty sourcing chemicals from different countries that may be hostile to our state's method of justice. We will instead have a system where the means used to carry out the punishment does not itself become a source of complication and great additional expense to the taxpayer.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Representative Kepper, you're recognized. Question or comment on the bill?
Mr. Chair, I ask for a comment.
Proceed.
Thank you. I'd like to make a correction to something that was misquoted earlier out of the Bible. The Bible does not say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder. And it is said in Exodus 20:13, Deuteronomy 5:17, Matthew 5:21, Romans 13:9. I could go on. But personally, I am against death, the death penalty. I don't believe that if I'm going to be pro-life that I can be pro-death in that regard. However, to the point of this bill, if the people of Arizona decide that we should have a death penalty, a firing squad is a much more humane way, and I think we should do things in the most humane way we can. And with that, I yield.
Thank you very much, sir. We're back down to you, Representative Kolodin. Any closing comments on your bill?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I do have some closing comments on the bill. My
Proceed.
microphone will cooperate.
Representative,
Thank you.
Mr. Majority Leader, hold up, line of sight. Mr. Majority Leader. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also want to point out some other disturbing items that were revealed by the independent analysis. For example, the state has a disturbing practice of paying its executioners, who typically are physicians with the lethal injection method, in cash, tens of thousands of dollars in execution. And unfortunately, Katie Hobbs has refused to release the records of those massive cash payments of taxpayer funds. So not only is our current lethal injection practice suboptimal from a transparency point of view, right, but it is also far less speedy, far more expensive, and far less humane than the firing squad. In my opinion, Mr. Chair, Katie Hobbs should have taken her expert's advice instead of firing him, but I guess that's why she has such difficulty submitting qualified nominees to the Senate. And so for those reasons, we will rectify the error that she made, and I urge the adoption of this measure.
Thank you very much, sir. So the question before the House is that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, it gives HCR 2024 due pass recommendation. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. Appears you guys have it, do have it so ordered. Mr. Majority Leader, rise and report, please. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the Committee of the Whole rise and report.
Thank you, sir. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, the question before you is that the Committee of the Whole rise and report. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nay. Appears you guys have it, do have it so ordered.